Losing children to Georgia may have been inevitable for many poor Southern parents, but it was never easy. It was agony, said Evelyn Quillen, whose 4-year-old daughter was kidnapped from a child care center in 1948. I prayed constantly that she was alive. For most of us, such pain is blessedly unimaginable. Georgia herself may well have been, as one elderly Memphian described her, as evil as she could be. In destroying families, she was also absolutely relentless. Stealing babies from playgrounds and houseboats, luring children walking home from school with the promise of ice cream. A favorite method was the one that had robbed Grace Gribble of her 3 babies, duping parents into signing surrenders for adoption. She must have had an easy time with Henry Wagerman, a German immigrant who knew no English. He gratefully signed papers he believed would procure temporary care for his beloved 6-year-old daughter. Georgia immediately sent Fanny to Illinois. Despite 2 court battles, the widowed father never saw his little girl again. Harry was tricked into signing a surrender in a courtroom, but the most common settings for this kidnapping method were hospitals. Georgia had spotters who worked in the maternity wards of local hospitals, and they alerted her when poor young women went into labor. Georgia Tann's workers stood outside the door of the delivery room, waiting. Dr. George Lovejoy told me in 1993. The minute the baby was born, they would take the papers in and have the mother sign them, and the baby would disappear. FYI, that is called coercion. I mean, on all levels, kidnapping, coercion, this is what we talk about, but a lot of women get heavily sedated or are in the throes of hormones, don't know what's going on. I mean, for me as a mother, right, I was put under to have my C-section. It was emergency, really bad. Anyway, I didn't even have a clear mind until they wouldn't even allow me to fully hold him until much, hours later. Right? I remember them gently kind of waking me up to see his face, and then they put me back under, but I couldn't hold him when I was in the recovery room until hours later, right? Even though my parents were there, they weren't even allowed to hold him. It was, let me just say. But this is what we talk about, right? And every state, let's be clear, every state has different laws. So for some, it's 3 days of changing their mind. Some it's a couple weeks, some it's a couple months. But they do this to target women. And this is on top of, right? This is during a time, I should say, although ish like this similarly happens, not to the full extent, but as we've talked about, what Georgia Tann was doing and setting up has full implications in today's time, present day, right? But let's be clear, during this time when Georgia Tann was actively doing this, right, not only do we still have the orphan trains, we have baby breeding farms, right, as mentioned earlier in the book, and we also have the homes for unwed mothers. So remember us reading that book? If you haven't, highly suggest it. We do have it on our channel, which, by the way, again, still exists because we have very religious communities like out in Utah who do exactly that. We have very religious communities that if their child is not, if they come from an unwed mother, or if the child is of a certain race, or the child has special needs, they do this, right? It's not just happening in the US, let's make that clear. It does happen in other countries, doesn't make it right by any means. But these things still happen. They still happen today in 2025. And I say that in a very frustrated and disgusting way, because you would think that we would be in a place where we're doing better. But it feels like we're not, by many, many levels, right? It is October 3rd that I'm posting this, and our government is shut down, right? And we could have a whole discussion on how that is going to impact families, right? Family preservation. Because SNAP, EBT, WIC, all of these things, people cannot gain access to. Not just that, right? Yes, those government programs are great and help people, but a lot of people also work for the government. They do. And now they can't survive because they're not getting paychecks. And that's a problem as well. And it's a trickle effect. This isn't the only year that this happened. This happens like every year, which is annoying, but this is the problem. We have to do better on all levels, local, state, federal, right? We have to do better. And it's, again, not just our country, it's a lot of other countries. I would love to see I wouldn't even say a perfect country, right? But like a better example. Now, yes, we could talk about how, currently Australia is doing better. We could talk about how Qatar has nothing in the form of adoption, right? There is more of a guardianship, a kinship. And that's great and all, right? But I'm sure there's other issues. And again, we could do a deep dive on that. I wouldn't mind one day, but we have to look at our country and understand that our country was built on not everyone being equal, right? Our country was built off the backs of the Black community and the indigenous communities, as well as the Chinese community. Our country was built so that men, specifically white men who were Christian, right, would do better. Nothing about any trans, community, nothing about anyone that was not Christian of any sort, right? There's different, I want to say sex, but you guys get the point, right? Not even Jewish people, not even pagan people, if you just did not believe in any form of Catholicism or Christianity, forget it, right? You couldn't be indigenous, you couldn't be Black, you couldn't be Asian, you couldn't even be Italian or Irish. You were still, even then, right? Even if you were white Italian or white Irish, because yes, there are Black Europeans, you were still seen as less than. You weren't seen as white. And we've had to fight so hard in this country, and we're still fighting for equity. We're still fighting for equality. And we see it here where this woman who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth took advantage of other people because she because she thought so low of them. And she realized she could make money. And that is still what's happening, right? People still see those that are struggling, those that are single parents, those that, are widowed, not nearly as much, but those that choose to live a single life, or choose to have kids later in life, or even too early in life, right? Being a teen parent, as less than. You can't win. You especially as a woman, right? On all intersectionalities, you cannot win in this world, in this country specifically, and it's so frustrating. All right, sorry for my rant. Let's continue on. 18-year-old Mary Reed, who gave birth to a baby boy in 1943, was a typical victim. She was still almost unconscious from the heavy dose of anesthesia, then routinely given to women during childbirth, when she signed a routine paper presented by a woman dressed in white. The woman was one of Georgia's helpers, and Mary's newborn was flown to New Jersey. Heartbroken, Mary brought a habeas corpus suit against Georgia. But her own doctor, who was also Georgia's private physician, testified that Mary had understood the nature of the relinquishment paper she signed, and she never got her baby back. So let's keep in mind that this doctor was getting extra money from Georgia, right? Georgia was known to bribe, blackmail physicians, politicians, policemen, etc., right? The mayor. So they got extra moolah for that. Yeah. Of course they do. In fact, she never saw him until 1992, when he was 48. A pilot named Steve Popper. He found her after reading my Good Housekeeping article on Georgia Tan and seeking the help of Danny Glad. "Oh, honey, I've been waiting for this day all my life. Ever since you were born, I've been waiting for this day," Mary said. Few of the separations caused by Georgia have ended in such happy reunions, and she separated so many families in so many ways. While Georgia sometimes had her own workers trick mothers into signing releases for adoption, she also often had actual nurses tell mothers their babies had been stillborn. Yeah, she lied to bio mothers that the babies were dead. She lied to the adoptive parents that the mother died or that they were horrible people in some sort of way, and often this gets told eventually to the adoptee, so the adoptee doesn't have truth. They're mourning. If they're told anything at all, which that is a whole other conversation, but often happens that a lot of these adoptees during this time were late discovery adoptees, and so they're told lies, and technically, and I say technically it's not really the fault of the adoptive parents when they were told the lies, right? This is something that my own mother was upset about when she was giving me information, and then it seemed like there were lies, right? And I had to explain to her, first of all, you told me the truth the entire time, so let's get that straight. Number two, it wouldn't have been your fault when you're just relaying the information, right? You weren't trying to hurt me. There was no intention behind, and yes, I usually go impact over intent, but in this manner, there was no intention to hurt me. You were trying to give me the necessary information, right? Now, I say that because at some point during my search, my reunion, that supposedly there were lies that my birth mother told me, which were not true. We still haven't solved why this individual, aka my paternal grandmother, had decided to say these nasty things. I have theories on it, but it is what it is. But everything that my mother had told me was exactly all of the information that my birth mother had told me, and I found actual evidence within letters, within emails, within other documents, right? So they didn't lie to me. Also, my DNA literally matched. That was a whole other thing. That was part of the lie. They were saying that my birth mother lied about who my biological father was. That wasn't, yeah, anyway. Now, I say that because, yes, it can still have a huge impact on our life, right? I'm going to give the prime example of Sam Berkowitz, right? Not Sam Berkowitz, David Berkowitz, aka the son of Sam, my bad. In one of his interviews, he had said that when he was young, he was told that his birth mother had died, right? And how that impacted his life, and how even though his adoptive parents didn't intentionally try to put the blame on him for the birth of his birth mother, which again, she was alive, he took it that way, right? They were told as adoptive parents that when you speak to your child about being adopted, this is what you say. Now, does that mean that every adoptee who gets that is going to end up being a serial killer? No. Okay, I want to make that clear. No. There were a lot of other things that I think really had to do with Sam Berkowitz, or keep calling him Sam, the son of Sam, aka David Berkowitz, and I definitely want to deep dive on that aspect, right? Because again, genetics matter. Nature versus nurture. My opinion, nature is always going to win out. And I say, hold on. Before we go back to reading, there was someone, and I'm so sorry. I think it was something Constellation Conversations. It was one of their videos on TikTok. And this was an adoptive parent. She was saying that, we talk about nature versus nurture, but oftentimes when we talk about it, we don't have the separation because you have both nature and nurture when it comes to biological children. Only when we're talking about adoptees is it nature versus nurture. And that really hit me. I was like, oh, schnitzels. I didn't think of that. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that aspect. And yes, sometimes adoptive parents can say amazing and do amazing things, and sometimes they're meh, and sometimes they're really bad, and hopefully if you are here, on my page or searching for help for your child, you are doing the best that you can, right? You can have the best of intentions. You can do everything, quote unquote, right, excuse me, for your adoptee, and your adoptee is still going to struggle. And I know that sucks to hear. I know that it sucks to hear. Because as parents, I know that I wish I could take all the pain away from my own child, right? I know he's not adopted, but let's be real. As a parent, you want the best for them. You want them happy and intelligent and self-sufficient and all these things, right? And when they do go through those things, even though sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not, but as a parent, wanting to make it easier for them isn't a bad thing, right? Wishing that is not a bad thing. Let me clear that up. Supporting them through these traumas is not a bad thing. That is a good thing. You should be doing that. Getting those resources, right? Having those discussions. And let me make it clear that we're not a monolith, right? So your adoptee may not want to talk about these things, or may not feel comfortable talking to you about those things, but maybe there's someone else, and that's okay, right? Respect that. Respect that adoptee's wishes. Because again, we're not going to all be the same. Some want to search and do reunion, and some don't. That's okay too. Some feel like they had a great experience with adoption, and some don't. Again, we are not a monolith, right, in terms of experiences. I'm not going to put down other adoptees for that. I just want, if you are here as a non-adoptee, let me make that clear. I just hope that you guys are getting informed as well, right, to what we could possibly be going through. And there is a lot of denial as well. And that goes for every part of the triad, right? Not just adoptees, but adoptive parents and birth parents, right? And that's why I always say that all adults, anyone that is going to be around the adoptee, whether that's you as a parent, you as a first parent, your parents, cousins, uncles, etc., aunts, uncles, maybe even neighbors, babysitters, daycare workers, nannies, teachers, camp, whatever it may be, right, should be informed at least to some extent on trauma, especially when it has to do with adoption, because you just don't know when it's going to be triggered. And I will say this, as adults, we are responsible for healing ourselves. But for example, right, because I just mentioned camp, my child does not do well with being away from me, right? Doing camp, doing sleepaway camp is just not, he gets very triggered, he gets triggered easily, and that's okay. Some kids are going to be like that, right? There's a fear of abandonment, there's a fear of loss. And by the way, I am a single parent, so I think that has to do with that. Whereas, my first, okay, let me make this clear. My first year of sleepaway was rough. After that time of my life, okay, I went every single year for two weeks. You can only do 2 weeks at this camp. And then I became a camp counselor. I absolutely loved it. Okay, this was my camp. There was another camp that I went to where we did sleep away. It was for soccer camp. Not my thing. Okay, no. Just, sometimes it's that feeling, and that's okay. Sorry, I'm going on a rant. But anyway, the point is that sometimes the situation is not a good fit, and you have to read your child's body language, and you have to listen to them, right? That doesn't mean you can't challenge them. That doesn't mean you can't help them through things. It just means sometimes it's the wrong time and place. Okay, sorry. Anyway, let's continue because I went way off. Irene Green was one of the many mothers who, as groggy from anesthesia as she was, knew this was a lie. "I heard my baby cry," she insisted. The nurse told her she was wrong. When Mary frantically demanded to see her baby's body, the nurse told her it had been disposed of. So yes, unfortunately, when you have a stillborn, not my lived experience, but I've heard from others, including my adoptive mom, that when you have a stillborn, right, you get to have a moment with that baby, with the body, right? And you get to make a choice of it. My adoptive mother told me of my brother, my stillborn brother, before she adopted me, and my older brother. That's confusing. The stillborn was before my adoption, after his adoption, before mine. Anyway, so she got to have a moment with the body, right? And she's talked about it. And I think that also is a really important conversation to talk about, as hard as it is to talk about that loss. I don't necessarily think it has to be at the same time, but I definitely think it's a heavy conversation that is necessary, right? Because you're not alone. Anyway, Irene may have understood the hopelessness of her situation even more fully than did some other victimized mothers. 2 years earlier, Georgia had stolen her 3 other children. Jim Lambert, who had been adopted after having been advertised in the press Scimitar, and his sisters Pat and Betty Jo, and she'd been unable to recover them. By the time her 4 children grew up, regrouped, and searched for Irene, she was dead, having left behind but her Bible. In it, she'd recorded their names and birth dates, and the inscription, "The children of a broken-hearted mother. I have no one to love me now." Parents duped by Georgia were sometimes unconscious for reasons other than having been anesthetized. When 27-year-old mother surrendered her daughter, when a 27-year-old mother, Earlene Phillips, for adoption, she resided in the Bolivar Home for the Feeble-Minded. Earlene's mother was there only because she'd been impregnated by her older sister's husband. The husband, a little country doctor, had my mama committed so no one would know about me, Earlene said. Then she had a nervous breakdown. So she was probably, and I'm going to say probably, raped, right? We don't know the age of the mother. We don't know if it was consensual. So I'm saying probably. Okay. But clearly, the man knew better. And no one helped this young woman. And it's not the only story of a woman having been placed into an institution, right? Because of rape or torture or other things, right? But also they were violated, right? We heard about Georgia violating the children. You know, if you know anything about mental health institutions, the insane asylums, anything about that, the treatment that they get is horrific, right? I don't think that there's any insane asylums around still in the United States, but there are still mental health institutions, and no, they are not always that good. Some are really helpful, some are not, just like any hospital is unequal in care. But let's just say that insane asylums really just were some of the deepest, darkest times in our history in how we treated people in general, but especially mental health, right? And we still have a hard time with mental health discussions in the US, but my goodness, like, nobody deserves that kind of treatment. Ever. Okay. Depression and heavy medication prevented Earlene's mother from understanding the nature of the paper Georgia's workers had her sign. But the young mother soon recovered to spend a lifetime mourning the loss of her child. Georgia was aided in her kidnapping by more than cruelty and energy. She was a skillful liar, as exemplified by a story related shortly after her death by 31-year-old Edward Russell, a divorced, unemployed veteran with custody of his 3 children. He traveled from Tiptonville, Tennessee to Memphis in 1949 to ask Georgia for help. She was very kind, he said. She told me she thought the answer was for me to leave the children with her at the home, go to California to look for work, and that she would send the children out as soon as I was located. I remember her exact words. We will send them to you immediately after you have established yourself and take care of them. He left for Los Angeles the next day. Quickly found a job. Hold on. I just lost. Quickly found a job and asked Georgia when she could send his children. She assured me they were in good health and in good hands, and not to worry. 2 months and countless phone calls later, he was still childless, so I finally quit my job and came back to Memphis to get them. I went straight to the home and asked Miss Tan for my children, and the only thing she said was that she thought it was best to keep them. Yeah. She thought it was best to separate families. That these children who are not newborns, but let's make it clear, newborns also have some memories, right? And can link to their biological parents. That anything that happened before adoption, they're blank slates. They won't remember. It doesn't matter. Their genetics don't matter. Their memories don't matter. None of it matters, right? Oh my goodness, because these families that are taking them in are so wealthy. They're going to be so much better off. I call bullshit. Bullshit. Okay? This is the audacity that this woman has. And the same mindset still continues, and that is the problem. People really still think that we are blank slates. Now, not nearly as many people, and not nearly to the same extent as, they more think like, oh, if you adopt a baby as a newborn, that they're going to be blank slates and everything's going to be okay. And yes, some of that conversation really is changing, and that's great. Continue that. But there's still the separation. There's still the conversations of, well, this child will have a better life. No, we won't. I'm not going to say it's better. I'm not going to say it's worse. It's just a different life, right? I myself have been adopted. Have I had better opportunities being with my adoptive parents? Yeah, for some of them, I absolutely have. Did I still grow up on a farm? Yeah, I did. In a different state, right? Yes, I personally, and I'm only talking about my story, I personally am not around someone who continued to be an alcoholic, abusive, drug addict, someone who deserves to be in jail and would put my life in danger, right? Great. Mine was somewhat necessary, okay? Does that mean that my adoptive parents couldn't also be those things? Of course not. There are plenty of adoptive parents who do horrible things, and we see it every day. Just look at the news. Look at adoptee talk, right? There's plenty of adoptees speaking out on the harm that they face, right? And even if it's not intentional harm, like I said, impact over intent. Sorry, my throat was getting dry. Like Colin Kaepernick, for example, who spoke about his adoptive parents. He still loves them, right? He still appreciates them. The thing is that he's talked about how the way that they raised him They, right, his adoptive parents who are white and he is a black man, did not understand the impact of raising a child who is not of the same race, right? So there was another level of trauma. He didn't have the genetic mirroring. And yes, even when you're adopting of the same race, there's still a lack of genetic mirroring. But when if my parents were, I'm going to give a hypothetical. If they had adopted a child that was from, say, Korea or China or Vietnam even, there is no one around, right? Even, like, it would be harder to find that community so that there was some cultural mirroring, right? And I have a cousin who was also adopted. He's Korean. His adopted family is white and Jewish, okay? And he grew up in a small town, and he's also gay, okay? So you can imagine, everything is against you at this point. And he feels othered, right? And then you go back to your biological community, right? Korea. And, and I've heard this from other people who are not adopted but lived in America, so I want to make that clear, that they don't feel like they fit in, right? They don't feel like there's a community. And I will say that even though I myself am white presenting but indigenous, I feel similar, right? You want to reconnect with your community and you feel left out because you may not look like them, you don't act the same, you grew up differently, right? There's different levels of not only trauma but privileges, right? And so what I was going with that was, even though his parents did everything that they could to help him reconnect, there were still issues. Now there's I can't think of her full name. It's Taylor something on TikTok, right? And I'm just giving a shout out. But she's also an adoptee. And she's talked about how when she was being adopted, her entire adoptive family, who's American, moved to China so she could grow up within her culture. And that's amazing, right? We love that. We see that. But that also, she was also saying that, like, she still felt like she was looking for her biological parents in their faces, right? Everywhere she went. And that's hard. That's hard. There are adoptees who, live in the same town as their adoptive family, as their biological family, and don't even know that they're adopted, right? Again, late discovery adoptees. And it could be kinship, but they're lied to as well. And it's just, even though there's that genetic mirroring, they feel like we always know something is off. Okay, I'm sorry I went on a big tangent. You guys know I do that. Anyway, where was I? I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. I begged her to let me see them, and she refused. He hired a lawyer and met with Georgia the next day in the office of her attorney, Abe Walder. I pleaded to see the children, and it wasn't until then that Miss Tan told me that the babies were placed for adoption in California 2 months earlier. She said 2 were with one family and the other with another family. A year later, having remarried his wife, and instituted what would be a lengthy habeas corpus suit, he was still stunned by George's deceit. I had no reason to believe she would trick me, he told a Memphis reporter. I adored her. She seemed so interested in my case. She had a kind, soothing voice, and I trusted her. A former member of the famed 32nd Infantry Division in the South Pacific in World War II, Edward Russell had been missing in action for 8 weeks and reported dead for 5. Nothing he'd suffered during the war, however, was as painful as what Georgia had done to him. We've just got to get our children back. They're the whole world to us, he told the reporter. But he'd lost them forever. The children remained with their adoptive parents. In her quest to obtain marketable children, Georgia was also aided by circumstance. At least one irresponsible parent simply abandoned her daughter to her. In 1991, the daughter, Barbara Davidson, described one of the worst days of her life. Her mother, who had divorced her alcoholic husband and married a man who hated children, told 6-year-old Barbara to don her prettiest dress. I remember her taking me to this mansion, Barbara told me. We walked up the outside steps, and I tried to keep hold of her hand. I could hardly reach her fingers. She told me to play upstairs with the children. She had business to take care of, and then we would go home. And when I came out, no one was there, and no one was going to take me home. I began to cry. A woman in a black dress told me, "Shut up, shut up. You are never going home. Shut up." Again, this is how the children were treated, right? Shortly afterward, Barbara was sent to the California home in which her adoptive father would sexually abuse her. Again, adoptees are at a higher rate for abuse and unaliving and suicide and was it parricide, filicide, by their parents. I think that's filicide. We are suffering, right? We are at such a high rate, and people refuse to listen because they really think it's rainbows and butterflies, and it's to help other families grow their family. Oh my gosh, they can't have children. And like, look, I'm sorry, but you're not owed a child. Okay? You're just not. And if you really care about children and want the best interest, you would help families stay together, if and when possible. And again, I say if and when, because again, it's not going to be 100%. So we get it. But yeah. Okay, sorry. I'm really not sorry for going on tangents. I think it's important, but yeah. Anyway, Barbara Davidson's mother was an aberration, the only parent I learned of who simply callously gave her child away. So abnormal, right? The other parents who surrendered children to Georgia didn't do so willingly, but were compelled to by poverty and the betrayal of the social agencies that should have helped them. Such forced relinquishments increased during the Great Depression. Georgia's range of interests was narrow. Her babies, her clients, and her family. Her attentiveness to local politics was motivated only by self-interest. National issues concerned her not at all. So while she profited greatly from the 1929 Wall Street crash, it's likely she did so instinctively, but unfortunately to great effect. The city's economy depended upon cotton. The stock market failure reduced demand and caused a worldwide glut of the fiber, decreasing its value from 29 cents to 6 cents per pound. The collapse of the cotton market, which sharply reduced riverboat trade, devastated poor Memphians. The Fisher Body Company closed its local plant, throwing 12,000 men out of work. The Ford Motor Company suspended operations. Employers cut workers' hours to 20 per week and fired 6,000 Memphis women, giving their jobs to men. The city's financial problems were exacerbated by the influx of thousands of sharecroppers and tenant farmers from Missouri, Arkansas, Western Tennessee, and the Mississippi Delta. Many soon joined desperate native Memphians in application to the city's welfare organizations, often seeking help for their children. But by 1929, these institutions were honeycombed with Georgia spotters. Instead of providing parents with vocational advice, they urged them to surrender their children to Georgia for adoption. Some parents relinquished their babies rather than let them starve. Others agreed to board their children with her while they searched for work, only to suffer the same fate as had Edward Russell. They were left suffering not only the loss of their children, but guilt over their gullibility. She knew how to spot the dumb ones, one robbed mother told me sadly, but these parents weren't dumb, and probably would have lost their children even if they hadn't boarded them with her. Once Georgia knew the parents were poor, they were doomed, and almost anything gave them away, such as application for the free milk that was routinely given to the needy. Former investigator Robert Taylor told me that the man who distributed it, Aubrey Clapp, was a spotter. Clapp gave Georgia the names, ages, and addresses of all children whose parents applied for assistance. So basically, he sold the records, right? Disgusting. Honestly, I don't understand how these people can live with themselves. Maybe it's because of my morality, right? I would feel so incredibly guilty. I would feel guilty. Yeah, maybe at the time you thought, okay, it was necessary. But once you found out that Georgia was a human trafficker, I'd be like, oh shit, I was involved in that? Okay, yeah, I wouldn't want to go to jail, but I would still feel guilty and want to help to change things. You know what I'm saying? Is it just me? Is it just me? I would not want to be friends with this person, right? And then going around and who could you trust that was her spotter? Honestly, all of them should have been in jail, in my opinion, but of course they get away with it. Clapp gave, we already said that. Georgia robbed every birth parent she could, but she most often victimized single mothers. They were made vulnerable both by their single status and Georgia's identification with them. The young women had no obvious similarity to Georgia, but both they and she were part of a socially unaccepted group, whose members were excoriated, in similar terms. Unmarried mothers were moral deviants possessed of excessive sexual equipment. Lesbians were sexual deviants, genetic anomalies of the intermediate or third sex. Georgia never publicly acknowledged her homosexuality, but she must have been aware of it, and in the repressive climate of the time may have felt shame and anger of being gay. I believe she displaced those emotions onto single mothers, and by robbing them of the children that made them outcasts, symbolically expunged part of herself. So FYI, this was not the author's thinking. This was the psychologist looking at Georgia, because no, being a lesbian doesn't mean you're any of that. If you're intersex, doesn't mean you're a horrible person. If you're a single mother like myself, you're not a bad person. No, don't get me wrong. Georgia is still a horrible person, but not because she was a lesbian. Okay? Not at all. However, that was how society saw the LGBTQ, and some people still think it, which is horrible in my opinion, but I really think that shame and anger at being gay was not what really drove Georgia, in my opinion. I'm going to disagree with the author on that part, but that Georgia's identification with single mothers caused her to envy them is suggested by an incident related to me by related to me by Valley Miller, the former supervisor of adoptions for the Tennessee Department of Public Welfare, who had been brought to Memphis from Nashville after Georgia's death to help make plans for Georgia's last 22 wards. During that time, she spoke with an adoptive father who had received his new child at Georgia's private residence on Stonewall Court. He knocked on the door, and instead of the expected maid, Georgia herself appeared. She looked unusual. Instead of her habitual tailored clothing, she wore something white and daphneous. It looked like a nightgown. She led him to her bedroom. The bed coverings were also white. Nervously, he approached where she directed, toward an upper bed corner where a tiny mound was surrounded by pillows and draped with a coverlet. She raised an end, and there was a newborn girl. His baby, he realized, and Georgia's? That is what he believed she was pretending. This baby is perfect in every way, she said. He received her and swiftly left. Yeah, that's kind of a weird pretend. Like, I don't know. Like, what was the point of that? That is very strange. Anyway, I learned about another of Georgia's stranger acts from a 1950 news article entitled Marriage Racket Laid to Miss Tan, Expectant Mothers Brought to Arkansas to Marry Unknowns. A court official in Marion, Arkansas, reported that Georgia had, during the 1940s, frequently been driven with pregnant women to the court clerk's office in Crittenden County, 12 miles from Memphis. Outside, Georgia would meet with one of an ever-changing assortment of shiftless-looking young men. She then ushered the men and women inside. They would be married by a justice of the peace. Georgia would pocket the marriage certificate, send the young man on his way with a payment of $20, and return to Memphis with the pregnant young woman. Why? Reproved by the Arkansas court official, Georgia had explained that she wanted to give a name to the unborn child. But Georgia, who routinely falsified children's histories, hardly needed to arrange bogus marriages in order to declare a child legitimate. Yeah, it is another strange thing. It's not like these are the children's biological father, but also they're not really naming the man on the birth certificate either. And then on top of that, as Barbara Bremen just said, our records get falsified as well anyway, in many ways. So what is the point of this? Anyway, let's continue on. Put your thoughts down in the comments. I believe that Georgia arranged sham weddings in order to vicariously experience what she couldn't have. Georgia wanted everything, most obviously the power that was usually accessible only to men, but that she achieved through her adoption business. Her father's thwarting of her legal ambitions was the important theme of her life. She bested him, becoming more prominent in her field than he ever was in his. She maintained control of her daughter as he had of her. She was a Memphian, as a Memphian hinted to me, a womanizer, betraying Anne with another woman. So Anne, by the way, was her partner, but she did end up, because of the time, I know this sounds weird, and I thought it was weird when I first read it, because of the time, as you guys know, you couldn't legally marry someone of the same gender, right? That only became legal during Obama. Here in the United States, want to make that clear. So it was common during that time that instead of legally marrying, right, because that was not allowed, that same-sex couples would, in order to legally leave something for them in death, they would then adopt their partner, do an adult adoption. Which sounds weird to me because I'm like, you're having sex with your now legal child, which is weird, when you could technically just leave something in a will. I think during that time, I want to say I think. But still, I don't know, it's just weird to me. Like, I understand because of the history of it, but at the same time, maybe it's just me, I'm just weirded out by that. Like, I'm just talking about the legality of that. I think it's weird. But then again, this was something that was pretty common during that time for lesbian couples. At least they say lesbian couples. I haven't heard anything about gay couples during that time, but also wouldn't be surprised. So, okay. But it wasn't enough. Georgia was a woman unable to directly partake of the traditional source of the female power, marriage and the bearing of children. Her adoption business helped her here too, allowing her to hover outside delivery rooms, hear a newborn's first cry, and swiftly bundle the baby away. She could say she had much to do with it. This child is 100% normal and healthy. Then this essentially cold woman could dispense with all responsibilities by giving her baby away on the next birth and adoption, in formulating a business that served both her pathological needs and her desire for power. Georgia was nothing if not resourceful. Her selfishness, energy, and connections made it impossible for any targeted family to stay intact. But the quality that made her the most dangerous was her gift for self-promotion. It enabled her to further revolutionize and corrupt adoptive practice by robbing birth parents she would never even meet. In the centuries before Georgia began her business, single mothers of all races were both allowed and expected to raise their children. Georgia inverted this custom in Memphis almost overnight, regarding white mothers and white babies. Neither she nor most other adoption workers of her time tried to place non-white children for adoption, the theory being until recently that there was no market for non-white children. Okay, so I want to make that clear that, and it was told in the Girls Who Went Away by Ann Fessler. Again, we have that reading up on our channel, that there was somewhat of a societal pull. It's not to say that there isn't a market for non-white children. Let me rephrase this. Non-white communities don't deal with the outcast of single parents like that as nearly as much. And so they often take their own kin and help out each other and build each other up. Okay? And I'm going to say often, right? So you don't usually see that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't circumstances, but we still don't see nearly as many non-white adoptive parents to this day, right? We do often see non-white adoptees, right? And there's a whole, transracial adoption trans country adoption as well. Or you could be intercountry and transracial. But often these parents are so desperate to have any baby that they don't care what the cost is. And so, or maybe they're struggling a little bit with the cost, and so because it's cheaper to adopt internationally, or it's cheaper to adopt a non-white child, etc., they'll take that, right? And that it's kind of their way of saying, hey, I'm not a racist. But then they do harm. So there's quite a few things that are a mix of those stuff. I definitely think that more non-white adults need to consider being foster parents, right? And understand that fostering does not mean adoption. Fostering is with the intent that there's going to be reunification. And that could be kinship, that could be fictive kin, like ICWA. That we should not be hoping that families fall apart. And unfortunately, too many foster parents do wish that so that they can adopt. They go into it for the wrong reasons. So, yeah. Anyway, continuing on. And she lost little time in nationally publicizing her justifications for removing white children from poor homes. Through speeches and in syndicated newspaper articles, she extolled the cultural and educational benefits enjoyed by adopted children. Social workers were more altruistic than she were soon persuaded by that of the best interest of poor, illegitimate children was adoption. These benefits came to be considered so great, and their absence so punitive, that single mothers who wanted to keep their babies were considered selfish. No, you guys heard that, right? How dare we keep our children? How dare we want to raise our own? How dare we fight to, be that parent? Why is it always on the single parent that raises their child, right? And not on the parent that is not there, who not always, but sometimes will abandon their child, or has an affair, or maybe they're divorced or widowed, or whatever may be the case, right? Why is the hate always on us? Again, we cannot win. Okay, sorry. And while it was usually only Georgia and her later imitators who literally stole such children, social workers throughout the country began urging single women to relinquish their babies, supposedly out of love for them. Oh, you guys know? Your mother loved you so much she gave you up for adoption. That's not love, that's abandonment in our eyes. Now, yes, our mothers could absolutely love us and want us. They were coerced. They were lied to. They were coerced. Now, in our eyes, for many adoptees, we see that love as abandonment. You didn't fight hard enough. And that's not a dig to birth parents. This is just our reality of what we see. It's realistically, we may know, and I'm not saying everyone, but many of us know that these stories are the cases. And emotionally, right, deep down in our hearts, we're like, but no, this is our feeling. And both are valid, right? It sucks because, again, impact over intent, we have those abandonment issues. Anyway, continuing on. Struck down were the laws that in some states mandated that single mothers breastfeed their babies for 6 months. Enacted before adoption had become popular, the laws were meant to encourage the mothers to become emotionally attached to their babies and want to raise them, rather than send them to orphanages funded by the public. Once these mothers' babies became marketable commodities, however, officials wanted to separate the two, rather than keep them together. Yeah, make it make sense, right? By the late 1930s, single mothers were not only being prevented from bonding with their babies, but often even from seeing them. Mothers were sometimes blindfolded during labor. Some social workers urged pregnant young women to sign forms allowing doctors to circumcise their child if it turned out to be a boy, so that the workers could keep mothers uninformed even of their baby's gender. By the time adoption became nationally popular in the mid 1940s, the reversal was complete. For the first time in history, white single mothers were expected to surrender their babies for adoption. That relinquishment was endorsed by leaders of such reputable organizations such as the Child Welfare League of America, the American Public Welfare Association, the Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, and most psychiatrists and psychologists. Dissenting social scientist Clark Vincent to a precinct to predict a future in which the newborns of all white single mothers would be seized by the state. Such a policy would not be enacted or labeled overtly as punishment. Rather, it would be implemented under such pressures and labels as scientific finding, the best interests of the child, rehabilitation goals for the unwed mother, and the stability of family and society. This scenario had actually been advocated 5 years earlier by Georgia Tann's client Pearl Buck, who had asked Georgia to collaborate on a book about adoption. Georgia dictated only 2 chapters before dying of cancer. Her exposure as baby seller apparently discouraged Buck from using them in her book, but the author continued to share Georgia's attitude toward single mothers. And in a 1955 article for Women's Home Companion, Buck advocated legislation forcing them to surrender their babies for adoption. Such a law was never passed, but the social pressure on single mothers was so great that reluctantly and with great pain they began relinquishing their children en masse. By the 1950s, 90% of white maternity home residents surrendered their children for adoption. They didn't really have a choice. If you guys remember, again, reading Home for Unwed Mothers. To virtually everyone but birth parents and adoptees, adoption came to be seen as the perfect solution for infertility. The availability of contraceptives and abortions would eventually be considered threats to this solution. Oh, let's talk about that. It's interesting that the Christian, specifically, the Christian Catholic, don't like contraception, but also want no abortions, right? But if you look very carefully, there is a statistic that I had seen. I can't remember where it was, but anyway, it talks about abortion, and it talks about social programs. And it lines up that abortions go down, the rate of abortions go down when social programs are given even more. And this happens under Democratic presidents. Now, let me say this as a disclaimer. This is a bipartisan issue, okay? Not about abortion, but about social programs and adoption, okay? But if people really don't want abortion, you would have more social programs, right? We wouldn't have nearly as much adoption. I know it sounds like, but what would you do? It wouldn't be nearly as bad. And we would not be targeting impoverished families, but instead raising people out of poverty. But are we doing that? No. And instead, what we're seeing is not only a rise in abortion, we're seeing people being targeted and dying from no access to abortion. again, the overturning of Roe versus Wade was beyond ridiculous. Now, mind you, according to the NCFA, right, the National Council for Adoption, in the last 20 years, so 2004 to 2024, adoptions both in foster care and private infant in the US have declined by 94%. We are making progress. But pro-lifers really don't think about that, because these same people don't care that there are babies dying in schools, young children, right? They don't care that we don't have, they want to get rid of health, oh God, why can't, I know it's under Obamacare, but you guys get the point, right? Like, they just want forced birth, but don't care about anything else. They really don't. Okay, but again, this is a bipartisan issue, the whole adoption thing, but if you actually look at all the statistics, yeah, it's just, anyway. But that was a point, because, that was another thing. More than half of the current Supreme Court are adoptive parents. Think about that for a minute. So, of course, they're going to benefit from this. Okay, continuing on. But in the 1940s and 50s, when partially because of social unrest associated with World War II, more single women became pregnant annually than ever before. This was the baby boom, right? Sources of supply for the adoptive market seemed assured, if never, according to some particularly avid proponents of adoption, sufficient. Some suggested setting up baby breeding farms. So kind of talked about that before, right? Supposedly they were joking, but the sentiment that impelled this suggestion was prevalent enough to cause socialist Leontine Young to decry the view of unmarried mothers as mere breeding machines, a means to an end. Same idea as surrogacy, not quite the same, but similar concept, right? Where some see them as a baby breeding machine. And yes, I know it's their choice. And some don't see it that way. I personally don't agree with surrogacy. And I say that because if you listen to Donor Conceived and you listen to adoptees, right? Even though there's different types of surrogacy, when you are pregnant with the child, right, you're now creating a maternal separation when you give birth. And that is a problem. Okay? That is a problem. We are not actually doing this in the best interest of the child. Again, I am pro-choice. Me personally, pro-choice. So I understand that women are choosing this for themselves. Understandable. I'm talking about for the best interest of the child. And a lot of the times, the surrogacy, through surrogacy, you have embryo adoptions. So it's not even like the embryo is even biologically related to, or, anyway, the embryo is not biologically related to the parents, right? But there's just so much about this that just, I don't know, gives me the heebie-jeebies. All right. Anyway, Georgia Tann's popularization of adoption did more than rob single mothers of their children. It isolated many women during their pregnancies. This was another reversal since throughout the years when young mothers were expected to keep their babies, the new mother parents who anticipated helping their daughters in their new roles had allowed them to wait out their pregnancies at home. But as adoption became more common, prospective grandparents who expected their daughters to relinquish their babies became reluctant to let their neighbors know that the young women were, quote unquote, in trouble. Increasingly, they hid their daughters in homes for unwed mothers. Maternity homes had existed since the early 19th century in the urban eastern part of this country, and since the 1870s in most of the rest. Originally established by evangelical reformers to rehabilitate prostitutes and other fallen women, for the institutions housed them and their babies for as long as 2 years, during which the mothers were instructed in childcare, a trade, and religion. Most facilities met their costs through charitable donations. Okay, I want to say this. Whether they were actually prostitutes or not, I really don't give a care. Okay? That, granted, I'm anti-religion in overall. That overall, trade, helping with childcare, not forcing costs and all that, great idea. Yes, they're forcing a religion, not totally for that idea, but okay, right? They were not expected to relinquish their children during that time. Let's remember that. There were, again, in the Home for Unwed Mothers, the Girls Who Went Away, by Ann Fessler. They talked about the woman, the person who started this, one of the homes, did just that. Helped mothers get back on their feet so that they were going to be successful and raise their children. There was education too. That should be the goal. Georgia didn't like that. But after 1935, raising rates of single pregnancies resulted in the building of more maternity homes than most communities could finance, and residents were forced to pay for their confinement by cooking, laundering, and scrubbing floors, sometimes for as long as 6 months after giving birth. The young women's maternity home stays were painful for reasons other than the hard work that was often required. They were allowed no contact with friends or boyfriends and often made to use fictitious names. When they went into labor, they were sometimes tied down and forbidden anesthesia. They were probably, I have a feeling that some of them were tested on because of this, right? Sorry, it's heavy. It's heavy. These young women did not publicly protest, but many recorded their feelings in journals written during their pregnancies. One entry included in Wake Up Little Susie, a book. Sorry, I'm going to get that book. I'm just highlighting it. A book about single pregnancy in America between 1945 and 1965 describes the panic of missing a period when single pregnancy was such a cause for shame. 2 weeks went by. They dragged at a snail's pace. Day was joined to day like links in a heavy chain, which coiled around me and dragged wherever I walked. I lifted heavy weights. I jumped from the height of the table to the floor until I didn't have the strength to climb back on the table again. At night, I sat in hot mustard baths and slept with my head pounding from the effects of quinine. I drank tansy tea and allowed capsules of turpentine. All I wanted to do was retch out my insides and die. I thought of dying. With all my heart, I wanted to die. When I didn't come around during the second month, I was desperate. My face became gaunt and haggard. My eyes sank deep into their sockets. My clothes were always damp with sweat. I'll kill myself, I would murmur into the darkness at night. I'll take poison and kill myself. Georgia probably never knew this young woman, but she exploited the despair of many like her, enticing her victims with such classified newspaper advertisements as "Young Women in Trouble, call Miss Georgia Tan." She and her workers frequently visited doctors in Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and other states, offering their pregnant single patients free room and board and medical care for the duration of their pregnancies. She allowed the young women anesthesia during childbirth. She exempted them from even singing hymns, boarding them in private homes whose owners cared less about saving their souls than collecting the $40 per boarder Georgia paid them each month. Georgia didn't spell out the terms of her bargain. She often told young women they would have a month after their deliveries during which to decide whether they would keep their babies. Some pregnant women chose names for their unborn children, only to awaken from anesthesia to learn that their babies had been stillborn, or were on their way to adoptive homes, courtesy of papers the mothers had been made to sign while drugged. Other young women who understood what free lodging, labor, and delivery would cost them acquisitioned out of financial desperation only. There were probably still others who, feeling trapped and unprepared to parent, initially accepted George's coercion, her relieving them of the responsibility of choice. These were the young women so many Hickory residents had insisted to me that Georgia had helped. There are areas grayer than any I want to visit, and one of them is here. I avoided it when I first realized Georgia's role in uniting the children who were languishing on baby farms with the infertile adults who, because of the baby's supposed genetic taint, were afraid to adopt them. Avoidance of more nuance than I could countenance had led me to ignore why these children had been languishing in the institutions in the first place. The time before Georgia, when mothers had not only been allowed but legally enjoined to raise their children, had been less utopian than I wanted to believe. Poor overwhelmed pregnant with their 7th or 8th child, some had no recourse but to give their infants to baby farmers. They needed a better option. Georgia's clients were generally more humane than baby farmers. The institution she created and popularized filled a need. Her selfish motives resulted in some good. Okay, again, Barbara is an adoptive parent, and her perspective from that angle is coming through. She's looking at this in such a lens that, like, oh yeah, like, okay, there's infertile couples, like, this is the resolution. I get it. You want a baby so desperately that you would do anything, but here's the thing, we're not talking about the best interest of the child. A lot of these children did not survive, or if they survived, went through incredible abuse. The majority. So for you to say resulted in some good shows how biased you are as an adoptive parent. Barbara, get it together. Okay, I'm sorry, because a lot of this is really good information, but sometimes that comes through. Anyway. But Georgia had no right to steal children or to sell them, or to place for adoption children whose parents wanted to raise them. She didn't treat the institution of adoption with the care that it deserved. How many, even of the young women originally grateful for the option of relinquishing their children, later regretted capitulation, motivated by what they would have considered their weakness? How many of them suffered from lack of support in determining what they really wanted to do? Giving up my baby has been the bitter regret of my life, Anne Cardell said in 1975 when she was 63. Age 85 and lost to Alzheimer's by the time I had learned of her, She was revealed to me through the words of the child she had surrendered to Georgia for adoption. A Maryland psychiatrist named Gordon S. Livingston, he easily evoked the fragility of the moment when the two first saw each other after 37 years. Anne herself appeared fragile, fine-boned, slender. Her hands shook as she passed him a cup of tea. But as she spoke, Gordon became most aware of her intense self-discipline, evinced by her carefully modulated voice, and even more by the mechanism she had employed to bear his absence all those years. She was the only child of a Vicksburg, Mississippi farming couple who had sacrificed for her education. She had never married. Your father, she told Gordon, was the only man I ever loved. She was 26 when she met him, working as a teacher. He was a wonderful dancer, she said, and she didn't seem bitter that he'd abandoned her when he learned of her pregnancy. I went to Memphis to have you, she said. I couldn't shame my parents. She had hoped that the woman who boarded her during her pregnancy would be able to adopt him, but Georgia sent him to a Chicago doctor and his wife. Back home in Mississippi, Aunt regretted her decision, becoming gaunt and depressed before finally discovering a way of coping with her loss. She pretended she hadn't lost Gordon. She kept him with her in her mind, watched him grow from infant to toddler to boy. By 1944, you were 6 and starting first grade, the very grade I was teaching, she told Gordon. He wrote in an article for Reader's Digest, I couldn't wait for school to start. I saw you in every child's face. When I administered IQ tests, I hoped the boy with the highest score was you. When I comforted a crying, defeated child, I feared he might be you. You grew so quickly that year, she said. You were aggressive and vulnerable, cocky and easily wounded. I learned you needed an atmosphere of tolerance and love. I tried to give it to you by giving it to all those children. It was an illusion, of course, but I half believed it, and when I said goodbye to that class in that spring, I felt sick with guilt. It was as if I was abandoning you for the second time. Then the following winter, I learned the third grade teacher was retiring. I immediately petitioned the school board for a transfer, and I got it. I'd be your teacher again this time. When you were 8, that year, as I watched you mature, I was proud you were becoming your own person, and I felt selfish for trying to hold on to you. At the end of the year, I stopped imagining you were with me. But I always wanted you back. I prayed that one day I would meet you as a man. I just sat there, immobilized by my own emotions, Gordon told me. Slowly, she held out her arms, and for the first time in 37 years, we touched. I was contacted by a few mothers who had relinquished babies in Georgia, perhaps still burdened by guilt and shame, refrained from responding to my classified ads. I learned of Ruby Burdett as I had Ann Cardell through her relinquished son. Memphian Solon Freeman found his mother, also of Memphis, through an ad in the classified section of the local newspaper. He was glad he took the initiative. Ruby told him that though she had wanted to, she would never have searched. She feared disrupting his relationship with his adoptive parents. Reunion has done nothing of the sort, Solon told me. My adoptive mother and my birth mother get along really well, and they go out to eat together all the time. And my daughters love both their grandmothers. Solon himself sees Ruby almost daily, sometimes helping her with a project that she initiated to give some meaning to her loss. She calls it the Love Home. It's a small maternity home operated out of Ruby and her husband's house. When I spoke with her, she cared for 109 young women. It all began when I watched a movie on unwed pregnancy, she told me. The Lord laid it on my heart that I needed to help young girls in the trouble I'd been in. Ruby's maternity home is as different as she can make it from Georgia put her in. My girls get good food. George's women gave us nothing but peanut butter and oatmeal, she said. She charges nothing for her services, relying entirely upon church donations. And Ruby's young women face no pressure to relinquish their babies. Most elect to keep them. Okay, can I just say for a second what Ruby is doing? Yes, this is what it should look like, right? And there is some amazing women who do the same in foster care, take in teens, especially pregnant teens, to help them raise their babies instead of, hey, you can't have that baby, like it's mine now. They're like, no, we're going to help you raise that child. We're going to help teach you to be a responsible parent. And I love to see that. I love to see that despite some of the horrors that some of us have been through, we're like, hell no, we're not going to let this defy us. We're going to change it. We're going to make changes. We're going to help people that were in similar situations. That is what we need to see more of in the world. Hats off to you, Ruby. I feel like I'm completing a circle, Ruby said. That ends our chapter. She is spot on. Okay, thank you, Ruby. We will get to the next chapter another day. Thank you guys for listening. Much love to you all, and I appreciate you.